Here we go. Hey everyone, I'm here with Jon Huckins. Jon is the founder and director of Journey Home and also serves as an adjunct professor of New Testament at Point Loma Nazarene University. Jon Huckins, how you doing?
What's up, my friend? Good to be with you.
I'm so excited for this conversation. We were kind of talking beforehand. Most of my guests, I don't know them, but I know you. We got to hang out. Over the last year and a half, I've gotten to know you, and I am excited to talk about pilgrimage, Camino, leadership, all of that. Tell us real briefly, though, just by way of introduction, just briefly what you do.
Yeah, I am a husband and dad of 4. Mm-hmm. They're all in like the elementary, middle school age, so we're in it, but we're out of diapers, which is a welcome respite. Have co-led with my wife and others and in our close circle of friends a house church for the last 13 years in our neighborhood. Very committed to proximity and shared way of life. And yeah, like my vocational time is spent leading an organization, like you said, called Journey Home. And our work is to heal soul and society. I'll share more about it, I'm sure later, but it's actually a new venture after 13 years of leading an organization called Global Immersion. Just in transition from that.
Yeah.
And like you said, teaching is I love teaching, and I get to do that now in a more formal way, teaching at Point Loma with it feels like teenagers. Well, some of them still are teenagers, freshman and sophomore primarily in college. And I'm a PhD candidate. And so some of that academic stuff gets to be played out in the classroom in a way that makes it be like, oh, that's why I'm doing a PhD. I still wonder why I'm doing it, I'll be honest. But there are moments where I'm like, oh, this is what all that works for. So
Yeah. That's awesome. And I remember you sharing when we were talking with some friends earlier, you even get to almost kind of do some youth ministry, so to speak, as a professor in a college, where they're coming to you with, you don't have to tell us any of those things, but they come to you with solid issues, challenges, life questions.
Totally.
Yeah.
I think as I enter now second half of life, I realize the college students are kids still in many ways. And even this generation is, I think, maybe a bit more underdeveloped than previous ones, just because of everything, COVID, technology. And so, they're beautifully fragile humans who are seeking their way. So it's cool to be with them that way.
That's awesome. I want to ask you a quick little get to know you question. And that is, Jon, what job would you be terrible at?
This was hilarious because it was really easy for me to think of one. There's a lot of things I'd be terrible at, but I would be an awful interior designer. I just don't have what it takes to be able to, for whatever it is, like cognitively vision a room that has like a flow and also some like creative meaning making out of spatial things. I got nothing. My wife is like off the charts. And so every time she does something, I'm like, where did that even, how does that even cross your brain?
Right.
But I don't have that portal. So I would be a disaster.
That's hilarious. Same. And also fashion for me. Like, I don't know about you, but like yesterday, so I got this new shirt for my birthday from my son, awesome. and I was wearing it, but it's kind of like a sweater shirt, like over. Anyway, but I'm wearing it over a t-shirt. I'm like, Robin, do you think I could wear this like over a collared shirt? And she's like, you can wear it any way you want to. And I'm like, yeah, but I need help with this. I need to know. I need some guidance.
Anyway, be careful giving me so much license to expand your wardrobes. Anyway. I'm just wearing my Camino fleece in honor of our time together.
I recognize it. Yeah, man. That's awesome. All right. Well, let's talk about the Camino. But what I really want to hear is just kind of your story to get us started. Just tell us your story and eventually what led you to walking the Camino and then doing what you're doing now.
You bet. Well, my story is very intimately tied to the Camino, as you know. So that makes it pretty easy. I mean, I was straight as one of the crew of the 90s who was baked in like non-denominational evangelicalism and then kind of fast tracked into ministry. So I'm not super old, but I'm in my 20th year of ministry now. And it's because I jumped in, like I got in the evangelical youth ministry world and went after it. And it was really meaningful and I was pretty good at it and found a bit of a voice there, but I also discovered that there was a lot of insecurity and ego that was fueling my desire to like kind of ascend the evangelical leadership ladders, and had a really important season after about 7 or 8 years of that, of depression, actually, because I'd stepped out of that role. I felt so much dissonance between identity and vocation that I didn't know who I was outside of my job, my title. And it really gave me the window into my own like kind of constructed self. And it liberated me in many ways to move towards a new season, which brought me to seminary. Went to seminary at Fuller, which I know we share in common. And it was invited into some relationships with mentors that focused in peacemaking world. And that to me struck a chord, like, oh, this is the Jesus, like a Jesus who has answers to the real life problems of today. And I spent a lot of time, actually, I got to study in Jerusalem as part of that, started to embed myself in some international conflicts where I'm like, the theology I inherited doesn't have any tools for answering the questions of our sisters and brothers experiencing occupation and oppression. And that kind of moved my vocational space forward to say, hey, how do I walk with this church I inherited, big C church, largely evangelicals, to build a theology and a practice for peacemaking and some kind of ethic related to that looks like discipleship. And spent the last 12 years leading an organization that did that. But it was in 2019 that even that, like, that was like, it was a hustle. And I was exposed to a lot of pain. And I think I was absorbing a lot of that on a molecular level. I was also traveling a ton and with little kids and still kind of like needing to prove something, I think. I hit a wall, and on a flight to Houston, Texas to lead a church retreat for a Quaker congregation, had my first like really bad panic attack. And the pastor picked me up and I'm like, I need you to take me to the ER, not to the church. And I felt like I was dying.
Whoa.
And they did the whole series of tests and they're like, you're fine. Have you ever dealt with anxiety or had a panic attack? And as soon as they said it, it was like my brain connected to my body, and like on a molecular level, it kind of like, oh, that's what's happening. And it was horrible. And my spiritual director at the time said, John, I know this feels like you're living in hell. And in many ways it is. That experience, it's one of the greatest gifts you've ever been given. To come to the end of yourself in many ways, this young in life is going to invite you to ask big questions. You're going to buy back 15 years, in many ways, because you could have kept living the way you were, but you probably wouldn't have been the best version of yourself or the best dad or husband or leader and he was totally right, because it just created space to kind of excavate why I was on a hamster wheel of sorts, even doing beautiful work. And I believe in it to this day. Some kind of displaced understanding of identity, some untended to childhood wounds that were manifesting themselves, and kind of how I was working so hard to find love or feel love, be loved. And I had heard the Camino was a big deal for a lot of pilgrims. I mean, there's 3 Christian pilgrimages: Rome, Jerusalem, and Santiago. And I didn't really know much else other than people that go on that walk are seeking some kind of healing or transformation or awakening. And I'm like, I'm at the end of myself. Obviously, I'm fit. My body is now physically breaking down because of something I haven't tended to. So let's do it. And I just went on my own, and it was a life-altering experience. It offered a counter culture to kind of the Western Christian leadership wheels that I had been spinning and been baked into, and said, like, when you're on the Camino, as you know, no one cares about your title or your reputation or how many degrees you have or books. It's like, what are you seeking transformation from, or in, or within? Like, what kind of healing are you pursuing? We're all just pilgrims on the way. And I think that's one of the best definitions of pilgrimage, is like, it's not about the destination, it's about the transformation that happens along the way. And that first Camino, when I was just by myself and kind of lost following the yellow arrows, I found a part of myself that that needed tending to. That, I'm not a super big emoter, but boy, I emoted my way through that path. And and I could share more specific stories, but that's how I ended up on the Camino.
Yeah. And so from there, you eventually started this new ministry organization, Journey Home. Tell us a little bit about why you're doing that. Why is that important?
Yeah. Well, something I observed myself as a Christian, like dominant culture male Christian leader in the U.S. I worked, for the previous decade with a lot of mainly Christian leaders, churches or nonprofit organizations, and some in academic spaces. In moderate, even progressive bending folks who were trying to do have our faith impact the way we show up as leaders and in the social issues of today. But I was also finding, as I was working with these folks like myself, they were kind of on a cerebral level trying to understand XYZ, race or patriarchy or politics. But they were struggling to not just read more books about it, but to metabolize it into to themselves. For example, someone might ask me as a white leader, hey, you need to think about ways that you're decentering yourself. Why am I still getting defensive about that? Rather than I've read the answers, but if I don't actually understand myself as one that's deeply loved, and I don't need to project my ego on others, I can actually step aside and really celebrate the flourishing of someone else who maybe needs to be in that space. Parker Palmer says that the path to wholeness is not up and out, it's down and in. And a lot of the leaders I had worked with hadn't done the down and in work. And we see the manifestation, especially of men, like the unexamined life of men. Name your Christian church that's been blown up because of kind of the culture of shame or the hidden sins, if you will, of leaders or the domineering presence they create. And I'm like, what if we created a space for me and my peers to go on a journey, not up and out, but down and in, and really wrestle with questions related to identity, vocation, and leadership. The Camino was so important to me. The mentors and guides in my life have been so important to me. What if we create a community where we do this work together? And I had a lot of leaders of color that had told me too, like, hey, can you guys do some of your own work so that when you come back and want to collaborate with us, we're not having to be so triggered by the way you show up in the room. And I'm like, maybe my contribution to working for justice in the world is to create space for people like me to do our own work and become more healthy and whole. And so that's what initiated this first cohort that you were on. Let's spend 6 months together and here's some elders who have done this kind of integrative second half of life work, which is really choosing that path of descent rather than perpetual ascent to first half of life. And let's create a safe space where we can put everything on the table. There's no question that can't be asked. And then let's walk the Camino together. Let's get on this counterculture to what many of us have inherited in our leadership structures and see what it has to teach us. And it was just freaking unbelievable. And it created a level of vulnerability and honesty that I think I've been unfamiliar with in the Christian world, especially for leaders. So did another one last year. And in doing so, I was like, well, I think this needs to actually expand to be its own organization and now get to do that. And there's a Camino pilgrimage and there's also a border pilgrimage, which is really wrestling with the mission of Journey Home is to heal soul and society. The Camino pilgrimage is focused very much on what are the conflicts in ourselves we need to tend to and our soul. And the border is looking at more at the social and societal conflicts that we need to tend to and what are the practices and tools we need to heal there. So
that's great. You've used the language a few times already, and kind of a big concept throughout the cohort when I did it with you and with our group is the language of first half of life and second half of life, which I encountered from Richard Rohr, a few years prior, and which was so helpful to me in terms of understanding my life and some of the things I was going through and what was happening, this transition from first half of life to second half of life. Maybe talk about that a little bit. What's first half of life, second half of life, and how does pilgrimage help us on that transition from first to second half?
Yeah. I mean, Richard Rohr has been the most helpful for me understand that too. And if you're listening, Falling Upward is a great starting point for getting some more context for that language. But really, first half of life is the invitation for us to build a container
Mm-hmm.
for how we see ourselves and our vocation. And,
Mm-hmm.
Richard talks about this first half of life towers that we build. And
Mm-hmm.
it's usually an energy that's building something, constructing something, it's working for something, kind of climbing a ladder, identifying what we're good at, what we contribute.
Yeah.
And it's important because it helps us kind of flesh out our unique gifts and contributions.
Yeah.
And at some point, when we give our lives to building these first half of life towers in the world, they might be holy things that we're doing,
Mm-hmm.
whether it's a church we're building or a nonprofit that's doing great
Mm-hmm.
work. We can tie our identity to it in such a way that it becomes idolatrous in some ways. Like we
Mm-hmm.
can see ourselves less about who we are as ones deeply loved by God and more
Yeah.
about this thing we built. And in the second half of life is really us saying, how do we show up in the world understanding that we are less about what we do and more about who we are? And
Mm-hmm.
when we rest in that, it actually changes the way we show up. Like if you look at the characteristics of a second half of life person,
Yeah.
they don't need to project their resumes on you because they don't need your affirmation to know that they are loved and enough.
Yeah.
So a second half of life person is generally entering a room with more curiosity, more listening posture. Second half of life person is maybe moving from head to heart. So maybe more aware of their emotions, more tender.
Yeah.
They're less defensive because we don't have something to protect. We just have an invitation to this gift of wholeness and deep love that we have. Like you can all see, I'm sure you in your life too, Marcus, like I have friends who have gotten old. They might be 60, 70, 80, but they haven't necessarily become elders. Like to be an elder is someone who's done this second half of life work where you experience them and they're like this open-hearted, joyous presence. Because they're so grounded in who they are and whose they are. And others have just gotten older and maybe more cantankerous and more defensive and more binary. And you're like, I feel like you missed it. And for me, and I don't blame them necessarily, but I hope I can be someone who's taking seriously the second half of life invitation to descend into who I am as one loved.
I'll give you an example of someone, not trying to be judgy here, but who was in just seemed to have stayed in first half of life. I didn't know him very well, but I'm a Presbyterian pastor, and at one of our Presbyterian meetings, we were honoring someone who was retiring, a pastor. And I was sitting next to Kevin Womack, a mutual friend. He was in our cohort, but wasn't able to do the Camino at the end. But we were sitting next to each other. And let me just, preface. You talked about building our towers or building our containers. I think Richard Rohr says we spend the first half of life building our containers to hold all of our stuff, so to speak, and our accomplishments, our achievements, and all that. And then the second half of life is about pouring out of our containers. We don't need to build it anymore. That's kind of how I understand it. Anyway, so the language of container building was something that Kevin and I would talk about a lot at that time. And so this elderly pastor was being honored, just cupcakes, whatever, but he came up and he shared a little bit, and he spent the next 10 minutes just listing off accomplishment after accomplishment. And at this church, I grew the church to 500 people. And then at this church, we had a building campaign and accomplished this. And I was just like, oh my gosh. And literally at the same moment, Kevin and I, we were sitting next to each other, wrote a little note on our, on our docket or whatever for the meeting. We passed them to each other, not intending to do this at the same moment. I wrote a lot of container building going on, and he wrote still container building. But you're right. There is a loss. Something is lost when we don't move into that second half of life, because there's all this anxiety. I feel like if you can't get to a place where it's not about you, right? It's about, lots of different ways to talk about it, but maybe about the love of God flowing through you, being poured out of you into others. And it's just about how are the people around me experiencing their belovedness through me. And I don't need any recognition or any achievement or whatever. I'm just here to love and serve. And anyway, let's talk about how the Camino or pilgrimage in general, whether it's the Camino de Santiago or any other kind of pilgrimage, how does that help us in that transition, do you think? Like, what does that
Yeah.
do for us?
I think pilgrimage creates a liminal space that forces us to ask questions we just don't ask, or
Mm-hmm.
invites us to ask questions we don't ask in kind of the hamster wheel of everyday life. And
Mm-hmm.
especially those of us in leadership, it's like, you got a million things to do. You have a bunch of stuff to accomplish. You have a bunch of people to please. It's very easy to start becoming bound by all of those external expectations. And then we kind
Mm-hmm.
of convince ourselves that we are that. Like, that's who we are.
Mm.
That's what I do. Pilgrimage is something that creates a level of dissonance,
Mm.
of intentional displacement is one way I talk about it. Like,
Mm.
we have to intentionally displace ourselves from the normal everyday like rat race in order to create the kind of space to be like, oh, what am I doing?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
who am I? And what are maybe some blind spots I haven't paid attention to, or what are assumptions I'm making about the way I show up in the world? Or here's a community I have completely ignored in my need to just kind of build my bubble or container tower. And I can see the ways that my blind spots is actually inhibiting healing and
Yeah.
wholeness for others. Pilgrimage is just, I think it's also very, I think everything's spiritual, but it's very spiritual in that our hands are open and
Mm.
kind of trusting that God is going to wake something up in us, but we can't
Yeah.
plan it. Pilgrimage,
Yeah.
you cannot be like, okay, on corner 4, I am going to
Right.
experience the grace of God in a new way. Like,
Yep.
no, there's no formula. You
Yeah.
go, one way we started talking about it on our cohort together was like,
Mm-hmm.
you go to get lost, because maybe when we get
Yeah.
lost, we get found. I think maybe
Yeah.
Steve talked about that on your
You did.
podcast too. Like,
Yep.
that's kind of what pilgrimage is. Like, go intentionally displace yourself long enough to get lost, because then we can come to the end of ourselves and all the ways that we control our everyday life and our leadership and the way we
Yep.
present in the world, open our hands and say, God, or fellow pilgrim, or
Yep.
the heart that I haven't listened to for 20 years,
Yep.
what's up? And
Yeah.
where can I wake up? I think that's the best definition of Mark 1:14. Richard Rohr defines it this way, that God, or Jesus, was saying, that repent, for the kingdom of God is at hand. Another way to say it is to wake up to the
Mm.
reality that is right in front of us, but the
Yeah.
reality that we're kind of clouded
Yeah.
out, we've clouded out with all of our to-dos and our ascension of
Yeah.
hierarchical ladders. And
Yep.
pilgrimage allows us to wake up, and that's a gift.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. I want to talk about two specific kinds of challenges that I think a lot of pastors and ministry leaders are facing these days. Just considering the way the world has changed, where it is a much more post-Christendom world than it used to be.
Yeah.
Right. There was a time when pastors were respected and honored, and churches were, held in high esteem, and that's not really the case anymore.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe a little
Yeah.
bit now, and maybe in some parts of the country. I'm thinking about the U.S. More than others, maybe some parts of the world more than others. But people, especially I think since COVID, like a lot of people have left churches because they're like, oh, we don't really need, maybe we don't really need this,
Yeah. Yeah.
and so that's a loss, right? So pastors and churches are trying to figure out, well, then what are we good for? I think that's one of the
Mm-hmm.
challenges, right? So there's a kind of
Mm-hmm.
loss there. And then the other challenge is the resistance that they may
Yeah.
experience in their churches. If a leader is starting to feel like maybe God is leading us to do this, but large chunks of their congregation or the people they're leading are like, no, 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 no,
Mm-hmm.
stop. Let's go back to how it was before. So just
Mm-hmm.
thinking about those two kinds of challenges, loss, having lost what was before, which was beautiful in some ways in its own time, but maybe isn't what is anymore, or what is needed anymore, or what
Yes.
we're called to
Yes.
anymore. And then thinking about the resistance that we might feel as we try to make those changes. How does pilgrimage, like how does that journey home, that transition, first half of life, second half of life, pilgrimage, all of that, how does that help us navigate those challenges?
That's good. I think one thing pilgrimage does is it creates space for us to acknowledge loss. I think a lot of
Mm.
us weren't given tools to process and to grieve and to lament a reality lost. Like this was something beautiful. And I think in retrospect, we can come up with plenty of reasons why various versions of the church we need to move on from. But as individuals and as leaders, like if we don't create space to grieve and we just kind of, well, that's over, so now where do I scramble to find the next thing? We're gonna, unprocessed pain isn't good news for anyone. It's not good news for the person. It's not good news for the people around them. And so pilgrimage, I think, creates space to grieve, to name loss as loss, and then cry about it and not really know what's next. I think if we all did that, we'd probably be a lot healthier and whole in our next endeavor, maybe. I think another, as far as resilience goes, I mean, when we are becoming second half of life people who are less concerned about some kind of a presumed metric of success and more concerned about being whole and showing up in whole ways, we can do harder things because we don't metabolize critique as a indictment on our character or on our identity. I'm just trying to show up to be the best version of myself. And so when we face hard things or when we talk about hard stuff that we need to lean into with politics or whatever, changing society, we can talk about it, one, in a more generous way, in a less binary way. And two, if people disagree with us, we can be like, okay, that's okay to disagree. Or you're disappointed in me. Disappointment's a big one. And I just met with a counselor who said that's one of the leading crisis he's finding in leaders today is the fear of disappointment. And so we metabolize, I don't want to disappoint people, but we have all these people that are telling us we're enough or not. One that's moving towards second half of life, it's on that pilgrimage, is like, I'm going to disappoint people. And then so what? Not in a callous way, like they don't matter, but really, so what? It doesn't change who I am on an ontological level, maybe I can receive that as feedback that I can consider and not get defensive with, but it can help sharpen me rather than like resistance as my world is burning down.
This is what I love about the connection between, so here, this podcast, we talk a lot about adaptive leadership, right? And I think spiritual formation is, especially in spiritual adaptive leadership, ministry adaptive leadership, right? Where you're trying to move from here to here in ways that maybe you have no idea where the next here is because you don't know. You don't know where it's all new, right? But formation is so important because you mentioned the willingness to disappoint or the freedom to disappoint, right? So Ronald Heifetz, I don't know if you're familiar with Ronald Heifetz. Leadership professor, teacher, guru from Harvard University, wrote in Leadership on the Line, one of his well-known books. He said, leadership is disappointing people at a rate that they can handle. And, right. Well, that's good. Brilliant.
Yes.
Which makes a lot of sense, right? You can't go too fast, but fast enough, right? You do need to kind of move beyond where they're comfortable and help them to do that. But it also requires in you a willingness and a freedom to disappoint. And that's hard, especially I think a lot of ministry leaders like to please people. I do. I want people to be happy with me. I want them to say, hey, this is all great. Let's do it. Way to go, pastor, or whatever, But when I can have the freedom to disappoint in a healthy way, right? Not like, I'm just going to disappoint everybody, right? But in a healthy way, here's where we're going to try this. We're going to maybe leave this behind. We do it in community. And some of you will be disappointed, but my identity as a human being, as a beloved child of God, isn't at stake.
Totally.
Right?
Yes.
And so for me, thinking about the Camino, it was an incredibly healing process for me, having been through my own dark night of the soul, and then being with you guys, for I described to Todd Bolsinger, who's our executive director here. I said, I feel like I got 10 new best friends, out of
Yeah.
this experience, and those of us in Southern California still hang out together, which is
Totally.
fantastic. I love
So
it,
good.
and it's just been such a healing thing for me. Um, and I'd been through some things, but it just sort of, it almost like it locked in some of the healing that God had already begun. I shouldn't say it locked it in. It was just it was an important stage in my own healing and development. And so there's something about just walking for,
Mm-hmm.
in our case, about 8 days. Um,
Mm-hmm.
one of the things I loved about it, as leaders, we're constantly having to make decisions, and there's
Yeah.
no decision making. Maybe you have to find a place to stay for the night, right?
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
all you do is you find the little yellow arrows, and
That's
that's where
it.
you go, and that's it. And it just creates, like you said, it's this space, this liminal space. You don't
Yep.
have to make any decisions. You
Yep.
just you just walk, and Jesus
Yep.
walks along with you. You have some
Yep.
conversations with Jesus, with other people, with yourself,
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
and that creates the space for transformation. And
Does.
yeah. Anyway,
And I
so
wonder
good.
too,
Yeah.
Marcus, how much just yeah, how much that economy of like just being present. I think some maybe personalities, some vocations are more familiar with that.
Hmm.
I think Christian leaders like us maybe are
Hmm.
some of the most least familiar. Like,
Hmm.
we're generally the ones that are moving things and needing to have the answers or know the next turn
Yeah.
and invite people towards it. So there is something very liberative about being, and it's also a higher learning curve for some of us to be like,
Mm.
whoa, to
Yeah.
release control is actually an act of
Yeah.
faithfulness and
Yeah.
openness and
Yeah.
transformation, maybe.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. It's I like that. Letting go, right? It's a practice of letting go, because you're not making your own path. You're not charting your own course. You're just following
mm-hmm.
the course that has been walked really for 1,500 years. I don't know, how old is the
Yeah,
Camino? It's for a long, long time, a
at
thousand
least a
years,
thousand.
at
Yeah.
least a
Mm-hmm.
thousand years, and you're just walking that path, and
Yeah.
yeah, and anyway, and it is transformational. So I'm super grateful that I got to do that with you and with our little cohort. And
It's a great gift.
I want to give you a chance just to talk briefly about Journey Home, and if people want to find
Yeah.
out more about you and Journey Home, where can they go?
Yeah. Yeah. So Journey Home's mission, like I said, is to heal soul and society. We believe that as we journey home to our hearts, like we've been talking about, we'll actually have the tools to contribute to healing society and creating a
Yeah,
society where everyone has a home, especially
yeah,
those that have been historically marginalized. And the way we do that is through these Camino pilgrimage and the border pilgrimage. Our website is journeyhome.info, and it's
hmm,
got info on that. And we are on Instagram, like Journey Home Pilgrimages with a bunch of
nice,
underscores in the middle. But yeah, would love to connect. And a lot of my work now is guiding these pilgrimages and then walking with leaders specifically who are seeking that healing in
yeah,
themselves and in their cities, and to offer tools both from my lived experience and then research also as an academic.
yeah.
So
Awesome.
yeah,
Awesome.
be great to be in
And
touch.
and I'll just mention, if anyone wants to find out even a little bit more, I did a great interview with Steve Carter, who is part of our
Yes.
cohort. And I don't remember what episode it is, but I'm going to put it in the outro, which is coming up in just about 5 seconds. So
Awesome.
anyway, John, thanks so much for leading us in this journey
You
and
bet.
inviting us into this journey. And yeah, I'm just really grateful for this conversation. Thanks, John.
You too, Marcus. It's a gift.
All right. Awesome. That was great. I'm going to
Fun,
hit
man.